Okay. I want you to open your Bible to Mark's Gospel, chapter 1. We'll open up here. Some of the things that I want to say this morning are kind of difficult to say, mainly because of the tremendous controversy in them. And so I realized right up front that those things that I will say, even though I'll try to document the things that I'm talking about, they're very, very hard for our ear to hear. And they're hard because of the religious influence we've all been under. And when I say we've all, I do not exclude anyone. And when I say all, I do mean all, inclusive, whether they be Hindu, Buddhist, Jew, especially Christian. We've all been under a tremendous influence of religion, and we don't recognize it. And so we don't realize how much of our thinking is motivated by that. And many times we think things unconsciously because of the things that are really, really deep rooted into us. And so I would just wish I had snuck and recorded that. So, because when you open your mind to begin to think, really opening your mind to begin to think, you will come to a place you don't see things like you used to. And what happens is you begin to rewrite that script that's ingrained inside, that religious script. To rewrite that script is very hard, but once you begin to rewrite it, the very Sabbath comes alive inside you, the real Sabbath. And the word Sabbath just simply means peace and freedom. And there's nothing like that. I don't know, you cannot get that from religion. You can't get the peace and you can't get the freedom that you get from the truth any other way. And that is what was supposed to be kept holy and sovereign. That Sabbath, the Sabbath that gives you peace and freedom. Not a day of the week. Paul tried to make that clear. So there's not a day of the week that you can find that or you can do that. And there are religions built on days of the week, including Judaism. Failure to understand the code to their own script, and yet building a religion off of the things that they had received that was coded. And by that, what I mean by when I say coded, just simply mean you had to understand the code or you couldn't unlock the mysteries. So I realized things that I would say that I would like to try to say this morning, and I'm going to use the book of Mark, and I'll use the book of Mark because it's designated as the oldest of the Gospels. Even though if you have an opportunity or if you have the Gospel of Q, most scholars and theologians would say that the four Gospels, especially the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, come from the Gospel of Q. And so the Gospel of Q is just a gospel of sayings. It's just sentences. In other words, it's not like a story form like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just sentences. Sayings, that's all they are. They're sayings. And so from those sayings, the scholars and theologians, most of them say that's where Mark, Matthew, and Luke came from. However, there is a book, which I have this book, and I should bring it. I didn't bring it because it's extremely controversial. And it's a little small book. It only has 16 pages in it, but it talks about the Piso family. And if any of you would Google that, the Piso family is where the writings of Josephus come from. The writings of Josephus does not confirm the historicity of Jesus. There is one line in the writings of Josephus that kind of refers to the idea of a possible historical Jesus. Only one sentence. And most theologians and deep scholars know that sentence was actually is a plagiarism. It's written in there. It's corruption of those writings. But the writings of Josephus was to try to settle some of the wars that was going on among the Jews who were settling in Rome. And so the Romans, the Piso family, who were actually the most wealthy family in the world, wrote the story of Jesus as a fictitious tale to try to bring some kind of harmony to all of the wars and the inner turbulent that was going on in Rome during that period of time, from around 30 to plumb up to 100, 200. And so there's so much available right now if people, number one, open your mind. When you open your mind, you begin to see things completely different, and that's what's so difficult. And I say that because I was very close-minded. I mean, I was very adamant. Bless God, it's this way. You know, I mean, that's how I was. So I can appreciate people who are adamant and closed-minded. I can appreciate it because I was there. I was that way myself. So things I want you to see or things I want to read from this, I want to validate some of these things by certain scholars and certain things it said. So in the book of Mark, and I say this, I actually mentioned this last week or the week before, I don't remember, you just have to get the CD. I mentioned the fact that we have what we call two testaments, the Old and the New. And that's a injection of Catholicism. And so most people say that Jesus come to establish the new covenant. You won't find that anywhere in the four Gospels. In other words, you won't find that in the words of Jesus. Jesus didn't say, I come to establish a new covenant. That's on better promises. That's not true. You only find that in the book of Hebrews. And actually, that's a misunderstanding from the book of Hebrews, because it does have, the book of Hebrews does have something to do with what we would call two covenants, but that's a covenant of the Spirit and a covenant of the flesh. It's not one that's new and one that's old. It's just two covenants. It's the fact that there is a covenant, and a covenant just simply means an agreement. That's all it is. It's just there's just an agreement here, agreement with the Spirit and an agreement with the flesh. And this was understood by all ancient mystics and mystery teachers, sages, and all of the. Well, it doesn't matter what school that you would go to, they would understand that there is a covenant, that agreement with spirit and agreement with the physical. And that covenant is, both those covenants are still valid, and they both are still functional, and they work today. So it's not a new against an old or an old against a new. And again, go back to misunderstanding of the Judaism and its religion of its God, who became Jehovah. Jehovah became the tyrannical ruler of the religion of Judaism. Elohim was the God of the Hebrew. And so there again, the lack of understanding and the lack of study really confuses those two. So I could say how many, if I was in a crowd of 10,000 people and I would say, do y'all remember in the Old Testament how that God was a tyrant, that God was angry, that God would kill people, and God would do, and everybody would say yes. And I say, well, then they would say, well, the New Testament God, Jesus settled that, and God's not mad no more. But the whole concept, the idea that God was mad in the Old Testament, is a misunderstanding between Elohim and Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Jehovah and Elohim. And I don't know that I'll be able to touch that this morning. I might be able to touch it somewhat in the book of Job, because the book of Job kind of touches on that somewhat. To understand the covenant with Jehovah, the covenant of Jehovah is just a covenant with the physical body. And the physical body in that covenant is designed so that it will reproduce after its own kind. So whatever the physical sows, it gets back. Now that's just an eternal law. It should be a no-brainer. And that is the covenant with Jehovah. So that whatever you sow strife, guess what you get back. You sow contention, guess what you get back. I mean, those are just, they are just inevitable laws. They're not right and they're not wrong. Many times we are just the recipient of the things we've sown in this physical body. And sometimes we're the recipient of things that have karmic condition that was sown in prior lifetimes. And that's another difficult one to appeal to swallow, that people have a hard time with that. The only reason they have a hard time with it is they haven't heard it enough. If you hear it enough, you don't have a hard time with it. You begin to say, oh, okay, it's just called the law of sowing and reaping. And that's a principle you can call, and I'll tell you another way it's called on the spiritual side of it, cause and effect. So on the spiritual side of it, there is a cause behind every effect. And on the natural side of it, there is a crop behind every seed. Some of them don't produce very well, and some of them produces really well. Do you understand what I'm saying? So approaching these things, well, let me just do this. Let me just do this before I read from Mark. And this, again, this will be a difficult one for you to see or to swallow, but I can show you. Turn with me to Romans chapter 3. Then we'll come back to Mark chapter 1. I can show you where the Christian church, the Catholic Church, the Christian church is not, never ever has been established on the four Gospels. Never been. The Christian church is established on the Pauline epistles. And I can go back and I can show you that. I can prove that to you. They are established on the Pauline epistles. Now I want to show you something that Paul said, and you can sidestep this, you can skirt it, you can try to make it say anything that you would like to, if you would like to. But it's still in print, and it just simply says this. Verse 7 of Romans chapter 3. And it says these words, "For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie." Now Paul up front is telling you that what he's saying is a lie. He's saying that right up front, right there it is. If the truth of God has abounded more through my lie. How many of you have ever heard that the truth can come out of a lie? You never heard that. Because that doesn't make good sense to you. And you can read right over that and say, that doesn't make good sense to me. And you know why that doesn't make good sense to you? Simply because you listen to your rational or your reasonable mind, which is more attuned to your spirit, your intuitive nature. Your intuitive nature will tell you these things. Your intuitive nature will tell you certain things that you believe from the Scripture that sometimes are outright lies. Now see, y'all have a really hard time with that. Because now I'm going to show you something in the book of Mark that's an outright lie. It's made up by a Catholic monk. Made up. They even know who made it up. They even know when it was made up. And yet we have been so inundated by this lie, we call this lie the truth, and have called this lie the truth so long that we believe the lie as opposed to the truth. That's difficult, isn't it? So again, it says, "For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie." Back up to the second chapter of this same book, Romans chapter 2. Verse 16 says, "In the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to" what?
My gospel.
My gospel. Paul didn't ever write a gospel. That's what he's saying. Paul says that God will do this according to my gospel. In other words, this is Paul's table. He didn't say God told me this. He didn't say Jesus somehow or another appeared to him and said, "Say this, Paul." Paul just simply said, "This is my gospel." Well, you know, I could say that this is the gospel according to Lynn. And you would say, well, that ain't got any weight whatsoever to it. There's no validity to that. But yet you will believe this one, that Paul says, this is my story. This is my gospel story. And he says very clearly, my gospel story is a lie as opposed to the truth of God. But yet we choose to believe that. And you do, I have, and it's difficult for us. And I'll show you where there is an outright lie. Mark chapter 1, and then Mark chapter 16. So go back over with me to Mark chapter 1, and I wanted, because I have been doing this series of teachings on a purposeful intent to get all of this, or a lot of this information that I have on CD, so that I can break it down from the CD and put it in print, try to get it in a book form. Because I feel there probably would be a very desperate need for this information in book form, because I don't know anybody or anywhere that you can get this information from other than different resources, pulling it here and pulling it there. You know, there is no devil in the Old Testament. That's a really strange idea because most people think there is. And Satan is not your enemy. Satan works as an immune system in your physical body to aid in your life and your well-being. But we don't understand that. We haven't gone back and done the research in the Old Testament to look at Satan from that perspective. We always look at Satan as an enemy. And we're always taught to do that. Because Satan and that particular Hebrew glib is used as something that withstands or something that is against. And that's exactly what your white blood cells are. They withstand and they are against anything that tries to violate your physical body. And right now we are in what we call the flu season, and so the medical field and the druggists there want you to even come by and we'll give you a free flu shot. In other words, we'll give you the flu for free. That's pretty much what it is. So that your Satan, your immune system, that's what your immune system is. It's your Satan. It's that which withstands the things that come against you. And it's working. It's working in you right now. It's working in you against sickness and disease because we are in an environment called the earth that's filled with a lot of things that are the results of cold and hot, cold and hot, cold and hot. Controversial energies that breed and grow things. So, okay, I know all that I just said is extremely controversial, but nevertheless, here we see this phrase in Mark chapter 1. It says, "And it came to pass in those days that Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee."
Where are you at?
I'm in Mark chapter 1, verse 9.
Okay.
Mark 1, 9, I'm sorry. And then I'm going to go over to Mark 16. Mark chapter 1, verse 9 says, "And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in Jordan." Now that phrase, if I'm looking at that phrase from a coded perspective, in other words, I'm looking at that phrase or that sentence, and I said, okay, these words are words that have behind them codification or deeper meaning than what you are reading from the page or what you're getting from what it says. Jesus is a symbol of the Son of Man, okay? So then the person of Jesus represents mankind, or I could say humanity. And Jesus, in the stories that you read of Jesus, Jesus calls humanity his brother. Doesn't he? His brother, his sister, or whatever. He's my brother. He's my, she's my sister. So he recognizes us in kinship. And Jesus always calls himself, or itself, the Son of Man. Okay? He always does. He never does refer to himself as the Son of God. Only some of the historians who are supposedly writing the records call him the Son of God. He calls himself the Son of Man. But you are called the Son of God in Genesis 1 and 2. You are. So that we can understand that the whole human race, the whole Adamic race, is the Son of God. So as Jesus being the Son of Man, or the Son of God, you are the same thing. So here in this opening statement, and I'm looking at this from a mythical standpoint, or from a codification, so that I can understand the code, the word Nazareth, if I understand the code, it's just simply the word Nazareth. You've all heard this phrase, that there is no good thing comes out of Nazareth. You've heard that phrase. That was referring to Jesus. He's just a carpenter's son. He comes from Nazareth because there's nothing good comes out of Nazareth. Really, that phrase Nazareth just simply means to be an offshoot, or it means that one that comes from a despised place. It's referring to the physical. And the reason it's referring to the physical and calling the physical a despised place is because it's in the physical, it's in the natural is where controversy is at. There's not a controversy between the natural and the spiritual. It's the natural that creates its own controversy. And it creates its own controversy through the tension that it lives in. Every one of you live in a tension. And that tension is between cold and hot. And that tension creates sniffles. You ever seen? I got the sniffles. Where did it come from? Well, viruses in the air, bacteria, different things. Your body becomes susceptible to certain things. Da 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 da.
When you was saying what you were saying about Jesus is the Son of Man, and we are the Son of God, the way I take it is Jesus is the way. That's why He's the Son of Man. He is the way we are supposed to do, the things we're supposed to do. His story is the story of how we should be able to take things and do things. Where the Son of God is actually the stick man, as being God living in us. So that's why we're the Son of God and He's the Son of Man.
So the story of Jesus as the Son of Man, I can say, is the story of me.
Right. And how we should act, how we should take things,
how we can act
love
in different situations.
Yes.
Whether they're controversial or they are complementary. It's a pattern of acting. It's a pattern of living. It's a way you can live life. So then again, Jesus represents you and me. Nazareth represents our physical body and the place or the tension from which it comes from. Okay? And all of the ancient mystery schools, I go way back prior to 2000. So if I'm going back prior to 2000, I have to get into Hindu material, I have to get into Buddhist material, I have to get into Egyptian material, and all of those materials had a Jesus story. They didn't necessarily use the name of Jesus. If it was Buddhist, they used Buddha. Buddha was not a real character. Buddha was a mythological character that was supposedly Saradatha. Or if I go back into Egyptian, which is the oldest, some say the most ancient material we can get to, I have the same story of Jesus by Osiris. Osiris is born of a virgin, had 12 apostles, 12 disciples, lived, died, came to deliver mankind. Same identical story. No difference in the story. The story is just much, much older. So again, not trying to make a historicity out of any of the stories and not taking away from the fact that they maybe could have been a historical character, but going more into the emphasis on what is the story about. The story is always about me and my journey, because I am, whether you can accept it or you cannot accept it, I am the house God lives in. I am the tabernacle. I am the vessel that God lives in and through. You are too. And all of this material, whether I go back into ancient Egypt, and I'm talking about Osiris, or I'm going back 2,000 years and I'm talking about Jesus, I'm still talking about me as an instrument that God lives in and God lives through. See, so, verse 9, it came to pass in those days that Jesus, or I can say Lynn, myself, comes from Nazareth. In other words, I come from the physical womb of my mother. That's what that's saying. Of Galilee. That's the wheel. That's the zodiacal energy, or the signs of the 12 signs of the zodiac. So I have my cardinal cross that I'm hung upon. In other words, a birth date. A day that I was conceived, and a day that I was delivered into the physical world, which generally deals with all of the 40s. There are over 120 something times that the number 40 is used in the Old Testament scripture. And it's always used as a mythological number. And it's always referring to the number of weeks that you gestate in your mother's womb. On a normal basis, a physical body gestates 40 weeks. It always, when you see the word 40, what does Jesus do immediately? Goes into the wilderness for what? 40 days. 40 again being the number of gestation. It's always referring to the time that God takes to build His tabernacle in the womb of a physical mother to bring himself as a manifest being in this dimension. So every time you go back in the Old Testament, whether it's 40 days, 40 years, and you will see that number, that's one of the most predominant numbers in the Old Testament, is 40. You see it used quite often in the New Testament as well. Still refers to the same thing. The number of weeks for gestation, the number of days, a number of time that it takes a fetus to grow into a human being. It takes God to build His tabernacle, which you are. So when he says he is a Nazareth of Galilee, that means the wheel, or the 12 astrological signs, and was baptized. That simply means he was initiated of John. The word John just simply means grace and mercy. So you were at infancy initiated in the grace and the mercy of God. And that grace and mercy will follow you all of the days of your life. And if you can learn to lean back on it, you can never, ever be disappointed. Because that is always there, grace and mercy. But you don't find that pretty much in Christianity. You find condemnation and judgment. But you don't find this. You're baptized, you're initiated, you're immersed in grace and mercy. You know, you can always cry on the grace of mercy no matter what you did or didn't do. You always can. It's just there. In Jordan. Jordan simply means in that place of judgment. That's what the Jordan River represents, the judgment. Whether it's a judgment that you make upon yourself or the judgment that's and straightway coming up out of the water, he saw heaven opened and the Spirit like a dove descended upon him. And there came a voice from heaven saying, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And immediately the Spirit drives him into the wilderness. And he was there in the wilderness 40 days tempted of Satan. The word tempted is this. If I wire this building with electrical wires, and I've got all my light sockets in place, all of my wall plugs in place, and I go to the main and I throw the main on it, what I'm doing is I'm tempting all of my light switches, all of my sockets, I'm tempting them to be sure that they are in order. If I put a water system in here, before I cover the walls with sheetrock, before I cover the lines and the pipes with concrete, I will throw the water pressure to it to tempt it, to make sure it's not leaking. It would be foolish to put the walls up. It would be foolish to pour the concrete down with those and not tempt them. Do you understand what I'm saying? You see, we see this as temptation, as something's antagonizing me. Something is tempting me. Something's trying to lure me. All you have to do is look up this word tempt. It just simply means test it and prove it. Just proving that the thing works. It's like God proves that the immune system in your physical body is there. It's there and it's designed to work. It's designed to do what it's put there as its function is. Now, go with me to Mark 16. I want to show you, because what happens is, from this point on, the introduction of this story, this is an Old Testament concept. This is not what you would call New Testament, New Covenant concept. This is an Old Testament concept that's rooted in astrology. It's rooted in mythology. It's rooted in coded language. So if you go back to the Old Testament and you do not understand the things I just said, if you do not understand the astrology, if you can go back and you remember the story of Joseph, Joseph goes to his dad and says, "Daddy," and he talks about him and his brothers and says, I'm one of the astrological signs. And they got kind of mad at him. Y'all remember the story, don't you? Makes it very clear to show that the 12 sons of Jacob were, each one of them, designations of the 12 astrological signs. And not only that, most people don't ever see this. You go back in Genesis and you can read this. There were 12 boys and 1 girl. And the reason they were is because they throw 2 calendars at you. They throw the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar always has 13 months. And then they throw the solar calendar. That's the sun, the S-U-N, which is the S-O-N. It's the same thing. It always has 12 months. So both of those are mentioned. That's why you have 12 sons and 1 daughter. And most people go completely berserk because they don't pay attention to the story. It's there. It's written there. The reason the 13th child is a girl, Deborah, is a girl, is because she refers to the lunar calendar, which is feminine. Everyone knows that a woman's cycle follows the moon, doesn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
it does. And so does a man because of the Esha, that's the feminine side of a male being. The woman has an Esh, a masculine side of her being. So both follow the solar calendar. And again, you have to go back and understand astrology before you get what I'm trying to say. And you have to understand the lunar side of it. Because if you follow the Feast of the Tabernacle, the Feast of the Jews, they always followed both calendars, both the lunar and the solar calendar. So that's why the dates are not, they don't ever come up the same. That's why you have Sabbaths in the Old Testament that didn't come up on the Sabbath day of the week. They had Sabbaths that come up all different days of the week. That's why you can read in John chapter 21, when it talks about Jesus being crucified, it says that Sabbath was not the regular weekly Sabbath, but was one of the special Sabbaths. In other words, it was not on a Friday evening unto a Saturday after evening that was the Sabbath. It was on a Wednesday, using our time of calendar. Why? Because it was one of the special high holy Sabbaths, which never came on the same day. And the reason they don't is because they follow the lunar calendar. And I'm convinced that if we went back to a lunar calendar, that we wouldn't be so screwed up with and have to have a leap year. Because our calendar is kind of complicated. It's off kilter. Everybody knows that. But nobody... Well, hallelujah anyway. So much for all of that. So if you found Mark 16, I want to read you something. Mark 16, verse 15. And my Bible is a red letter edition. So I'm not sure if your Bible is a red letter edition, but my Bible as a red letter edition is implying that Jesus said this. However, the historical records indicate that this is not even in the original Gospel of Mark. So if it's not even in the original Gospel of Mark, Jesus couldn't have said it. And if here they're trying to sell you the idea that Jesus did say this, it's obviously they're trying to sell you a lie and call it the truth. Because Jesus didn't say this. But the red letter Bible says he did. And not only that, but what I'm fixing to read and what I'm fixing to show you is what the foundation of Christianity is built on. And if it's built on a lie, then we have got to face the reality of that lie. And you have to understand, I love the Bible. I do. I have given my whole life to study this book. And still do. And I get upset many times when I see the additions or the deletions. And I get upset about it. But still I say, it is a fabulous book filled with fabulous truths. But you got to find them. Because when you do, you're going to start thinking different. You'll start to think out of the box. So here you go. Chapter 16, verse 15, and he said unto them, Go ye into all of the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. This is a lie. This is where Christianity builds its foundational. What's the foundation of it? If you don't get saved, what are you going to get?
And you got to be baptized too.
You got to be baptized and you got to be saved. And if you don't get saved and you don't get baptized, then what do you get? The very next phrase. He that believeth not shall be what? Damned. 2 words right there, saved and damned. Y'all are so familiar with them. The whole Christian community is so familiar with them, but haven't got a clue what they mean. Haven't got a clue why they were inserted there. They were inserted, these are lies that have been put there so that they can hold this over you and me and create fear, because nobody wants to burn. Right? But you have this deep-rooted inside you that says, well, if I don't get saved, I'll be damned. I'll be cursed. Yeah, right. All right. Let me read you something in light of those two things. This is the Gospel in the Zodiac. If you don't have it, you ought to get that book. This is by Darlington. He wrote this book about 6, 8, 10 years ago. It's a phenomenal book, and it is a book that's written on the Gospel of Mark, saying that the writing of Mark was or is written on the 12 astrological signs. Darlington, Bill Darlington, Darlison, Darlington, the Gospel and the Zodiac. Phenomenal book. Let me read you, this is an introduction about something he says. He talks about Irenaeus, and I'm going to talk some more about this particular character. As a matter of fact, it is stated in many theological, and I'm talking about some solid works, Bart Ehrman, and many others that have said these things, Wheelis, about Irenaeus. They said there has no theologian lied as much as Irenaeus, and it is in print for anybody to read. And he is called the father of Christianity. He wrote, his books are the foundation from which any student who goes to seminary studies from to lay the foundation of Christianity in the preacher. Irenaeus. Irenaeus, Orthodox first systematic apologist, goes to great length to prove that Jesus exercised his ministry over many years in order to counter the contention of various Gnostic groups. Now, this was something that was going on somewhere around 180 to 200 when Irenaeus was a bishop in Rome. So he goes to great lengths to prove that Jesus exercised his ministry over many years, in other words, 3.5 years. That's what he tries to say. In order to counter the contention of various Gnostic groups. When he's talking about the Gnostic groups, when you really look at the early Christian church from 300 BC plumb up to 150 to 300 CE, when you look at that, you realize that the Essenes and Gnostics were pretty much of the same community. The Essenes were earlier, the Gnostics were later, and they all were pretty much embracing some of the same things. In other words, they were embracing the idea that the story of Jesus was another story of the astrological sun, and its 1 year progression. So he goes to great lengths to prove that Jesus exercised his ministry over many years in order to counter the contention of various Gnostic groups, principally the followers of Valentinus, that Jesus taught for 1 year only, and further that he suffered in the 12th month. And he quotes, this is from Irenaeus, page 200. He goes on, and listen to this. He says, the task of an aspirant was to attain spiritual freedom by overcoming the bondage to the flesh. That's a good statement. That's your task. The task of an aspirant, in other words, an aspirant is one who's initiated into the truth. It's someone who you can, call them whatever you want. You have a conviction. You come to a place in your life, you want greater truth. You come to a place you want to know who you are. You come to a place where you're stirred, you're strong. And that usually happens to everybody. More than one time in their life. That happened to all of you. Many times you grow up and you come to that point, you could have been 6, 7, 8 years old. Or you could have been 21 or 26 or whatever. You come to that. Everybody comes to that place many times. The task of an aspirant was to attain spiritual freedom by overcoming bondage to the flesh. Despite the variety of ways in which it manifests, Gnosticism was concerned with the interior life of spirit, with illumination, which could be attained through prayer, meditation, and performance of specific rituals. God was to be experienced within the depths of the individual rather than demonstrated rationally or objectively historically. Gnosis, which comes from the Greek word knowledge, is not primarily rational knowledge, but insight. Gnosis involves the intuitive process of knowing yourself. To know yourself is to know your nature and your destiny. Yet to know oneself at the deepest level is simultaneously the same as knowing God. That's pretty stout. So, Bill Darlison. So he's saying that Irenaeus and the things that Irenaeus was contending for weren't necessarily the truth. And goodness, there's so much about this particular writer, Irenaeus, that it's crazy. I want to read you something else here from another author who is one of my favorite authors. And this is Alan Boyd Kuhn. Alan Boyd Kuhn, let's see. And I'm reading from Who is the King of Glory? This is a phenomenal book. Who is the King of Glory? And here, he says this. Wheelis comments, and Wheelis is he is a scholar, he is a theologian. He comments on this, that of course he did not and could not, they were not yet written. He's talking about these verses in Mark that I just read to you. This is what Wheelis says. No other pope, bishop, or father except Papias until Irenaeus, for nearly a century after Pope Clement, and it's amazing that we don't have the writings of Clement. For some reason the Catholic Church got rid of all of them. I don't know why they would do that. Why would they get right? Well, I do know why they would get rid of them, because of the content of what they said. Because there are many times they are quoted out of context to show that he was a heretic. Because he said things, well, let me read some of the things that he said. Pope Clement never mentions or quotes a gospel. He was a bishop, he was a pope, one of the earlier popes of the church, but he never, no one ever mentioned the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John until after 180. Irenaeus. Irenaeus is the first one to ever mention a Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Now, can you imagine that there wasn't a Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John circulating in the church for the first 150 years? Just wasn't there. Now, I realize the wheels in your brain can't hardly think that there wasn't a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No. So here he goes on. He says, Pope Clement never mentioned the gospel or the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John for a century and a half until the books bobbed up in the hands of Bishop Irenaeus. By the way, let me just say this. At that same time, around 180, 185, 190, bobbing up in the hands of Irenaeus were 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Titus. Those are called the pastoral epistles. If they were truly Pauline, why didn't they circulate in the church during the time of Paul? They didn't. They're never mentioned for the first 150 years from the time of Paul. What was Paul? He had his experience around 40, 45, 46, and he was finally killed around 65, 66, 68, somewhere along in there, up until 180. Those books aren't circulated at all in the church. Makes wheels turn, doesn't it? So for 150 years, until the books bobbed up in the hands of Bishop Irenaeus, were tagged as Gospels according to this or that apostle. There existed not a word of them in all the tiresome tombs of the fathers. It is humanly and divinely impossible that the apostolic authorship and hence canonicity of divine inspiration of these sacred four should have remained for a century and a half unknown. Let me read some more here. There has been much question of the genuineness of Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. On this, the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the conclusion of Mark 16, 9 through 20 is admittedly not genuine. That's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Admittedly not genuine. If it's admittedly not genuine, that means somebody added it. And if somebody added it and they added these words, you must go and get everybody saved or they'll be damned. Cursed. That's all been added. What was the motivation behind that addition? The motivation behind that addition was to put fear in the minds of people. The conclusion of Mark 16, 9 through 20 is admittedly not genuine. Still less can the shorter conclusion lay claim to genuineness. Of the 15th and the 16th verses of this chapter, go into all the world and preach the gospel, and the quote saved and the quote damned clauses are obviously inner pollution. Reinach, who is also a scholar, says that it is a late addition and is not found in the best manuscripts. The New Standard Bible Dictionary says the same thing. That states the longer version has against it the testimony of the two oldest unical manuscripts, the Sinaitica and the Vatican, of one or two of the early versions, all of which close the chapter in verse 8. So they close the Gospel of Mark in, and he goes on and on and on and on. He quotes from other sources about this same identical thing. So what I'm trying to say, or maybe what I am saying, and it's difficult, is the saved that Mark Gospel talks about and or the damned are pollutions. They're not really there. So if they're not really there and your goal is not necessarily to go get everybody saved or they're going to be damned, then what is your goal? And I would come back to say it simply this, that your goal in life is to know you. To go back to what I read from, was it Kuhn or was it Darlington? I believe it was Darlington. To come back to this, the task of every, I would just say it this way, the task of every human being is to obtain spiritual freedom by overcoming the bondage of the flesh. And the bondage of the flesh is just the fact that it has been deposited in the earth as this instrument of God, this vehicle of God, that yet is subjected to the elements of this dimension. And these elements of this dimension have within it, I guess I could say, negative energies, or they have within it things that will hinder the well-being of your physical body. Anybody ever sense that? Should I just say everybody does sense that? Don't we? I do, you do, I know we all do. So even you can strive or you can work diligently to maintain health in a society that seems to be contrary to your health. That's where we live. We live in a society that is that. We live in a society that, I was talking to a guy just this week, earlier this week, that you can go to Mexico and you can get certain aid, physical aid from the medical profession there that does work that you can't get here. Now isn't that erroneous? Oscar Poole, which all of you know, good friend of mine, Oscar Poole was pronounced a death sentence about 5 or 6 years ago because he had a heart issue, and they said they gave him a year to live. And so what he did was he and 4 other people got together and they got a doctor from Switzerland who was doing a procedure, an outpatient procedure, that would correct the problem that Oscar Poole had as an outpatient and give him many more years on his life. And so Oscar opted to do that. And he had to pay, him and all these other people paid to fly this surgeon over here, Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. I spent the day with Oscar down there while he was under the knife of this particular surgeon. This has been 5 or 6 years ago. And Oscar Poole, if you follow him any on Facebook or you hear about him, he's traveling all over the world, him and his wife. They just come back from a train trip all the way to California. Been gone for 3 months. Living life. Living life. Knocking on 90. Living life. Not dead. And not succumbing to the American Medical Association. Because if he followed their procedure, he'd be dead man. So what's happening to us? They try to poison us through the foods, try to poison us through the water you drink. So is your body, is it subjected to all kinds of things that are not healthy for it? Absolutely, always. Does God prepare for that? Absolutely, always. So there is a system within us, and again, I'm saying this system is Satan. And it's so difficult to say that, to understand that Satan, I'm using the word Satan, and I spell it, I'm not even worried about putting it on the board. I've done way past that. I should have put my stick man up a long time ago and spell Satan. Sheen Taut Noun is how you spell it in Hebrew, but just the compilation of those glyphs, when you begin to see the compilation of those glyphs, the Sheen has to do with fire and water. That's basically why it sounds the way it sounds. Is if you put fire in water, it goes sizzles. And that's what the Hebrew Sheen is about. The sizzle of spirit, which is God, fire. God is fire, light, in physical matter. So when you put God into physical matter, he cools off. He's still there. You know, there's still a little spark in everybody. You didn't distinguish it. It's still there. It just waits on a chance to stir. And that's how the name Satan starts out, with that glyph of fire and water. So it's energy and power. You see, that energy, that power is resident in you all the time. It creates miracles. I don't think that there is a key to turn loose that power, that energy, so that someone can wave a magic wand, or you can drink a special formula of water, or pour special olive oil over you and release that energy. However, that energy many times is released through those methods from you yourself, and you don't know it. Because I do not discredit the miracles that were done through Oral Roberts, through the tent ministry, through William Branham, through A.A. Allen, through Catherine Kuhlman, through all these people. What they did is some way, the things that they said, or the way that they, Catherine Kuhlman, she pop her feet together and do her little dance, and they said people would just fall. What I'm saying is that there was a release, there was a move, there is a energy of the Spirit that releases, and you emotionally grab hold of it. When you emotionally grab hold of it, you open yourself up to this energy, Satan. And this energy, Satan, starts out first off with the Sheen, the power of God to do a miracle in you, in your physical body. I remember years ago I was praying that not that I would lay hands on people, but that my words would be like the pen of a ready writer, that somehow or another that I would be able to use my words to release the energy of the power of God individually in people, whether it be small groups or mass groups, that it wouldn't be anything I did, it would be something that the people themselves do by that igniting of that word. The second glyph in this particular compilation of Hebrew glyphs is taut, which means a sail. Taut, that's what the word means. It's number 9. It means a sail. And it has to do with femininity. In other words, it has to do with the ability to reproduce itself. And if you do, I told y'all to follow a little thing somewhere last week, I think, to YouTube this. That's what your white blood cells do. If you have a deficiency in your white blood cells, they call it leukemia. But your white blood cells are just like an army that goes against and attacks anything in your physical body. This is the center glyph of the Hebrew word, Satan. Now, of course, right now I'm telling you about the power of God, the sheen. Right now I'm telling you about the taut, the cell, the white blood cell that works with you, unless you've got your immune system so run down, and we do. It's like I say, our food and everything else that just about we're subject to, it tires your immune system down. And so, that's the taut. Now right now I've got 2 out of the 3 glyphs, and I don't think there's anything negative about them that sounds anything like a damnation or a curse, does it? And then the final non, which actually means inner freedom of life. So hallelujah, when you put this powerful glyph together, and we call this Satan, and in the Old Testament it's used for the word withstand, it's used for the word adversary, and that's exactly what your white blood cells are. They're adversaries to any kind of disease or anything that's coming against your body that's a foreign power. And so, to go with me to the book of Job, go with me to Job chapter 1. Job, the book of Job, Satan, the word, the Hebrew glyph, Satan, is used more times in the book of Job in the first 2 chapters than anywhere in the whole Bible. It's used 14 times. 7 times in the first chapter, 7 times in the second chapter. And it's only used 19 times in the whole Bible. 14 of those 19 times is the book of Job. So would you have an idea that possibly the book of Job would be about Satan? Something about Satan. And I would say you would be right. It does, but it only uses it in the introduction. It doesn't use it anymore after its introduction. Doesn't use it at all. So Job 1 and 2, and again, let me just say this about the name Job, is he who weeps or cries out of a hollow place. He actually is just a picture of your physical body that's in desperate need. And most people would look at Job's life and they say, pretty well describes him, because it looks like he was in sad shape. I mean, you know, everything he did seemed like went wrong or sour, didn't it? Everybody you heard about, well, it comes and kills all of his herds and his flocks and kills his animals and wipes all that out. And then they said, hey, Job, this looks like, man, it's not a good day for you, buddy. It looks like God's done rained fire down and killed all your crops, burnt your crops up. You ain't got no crops now. Then there's one other come running down and say, hey, Job, it's not looking too good for you, bud. Now they've wiped out all your kids. God done killed every one of your kids. And that's right here in the first 2 chapters. And so this guy, that's why his name Job means he who cries out of a hollow place. It's just exactly like your physical man. That's when you're physical. Without God, you're nothing. Hello? Without God, we are in sad shape. And all of these things seem to be coming against us. And all of these things have associated with them this Satan. Not that Satan is doing any of those things. As a matter of fact, it didn't say that Satan did those things. It said that God did those things. God killed his flocks. God burned his crops. God killed his children. That's how the story starts out. So, Job chapter 1, verse 6, it says, and there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. By the way, the word God here is Elohim, and the word Lord here is Jehovah, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Elohim has to do with the 12 astrological signs that creates a physical body in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1 is the blueprint of the physical body. In Genesis 2 and 3 is the incubation of that blueprint in a literal, natural, physical way. Genesis 1 gives you the blueprint, gives you the outline, the diagram for it. Genesis 2 and 3 is where it's incubated, it's formed. Genesis 1 is where it comes from nothing. It's the no-thingness. It's the absolute. That's what it's called in Isaiah. In Genesis 2 is where it's Yetzirah, formed. It's built, it's put together. It's just exactly like I have a blueprint out there on what we're trying to do in here. And you'll be able to come in here hopefully just in the next few weeks or so, and you'll begin to see the blueprint in formation. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, there's not any confusion. I remember Gary, her husband, used to ask me always, he said, yeah, well, Lynn, Genesis 1 is this and Genesis 2. There's two different atoms here. No, there isn't. It's the same atom. One of them is a blueprint, it's a design. The other one is the physical building of the tabernacle. And that's it. God drew a blueprint of it. So Genesis chapter 1 is Elohim at work. It's 32 times the name Elohim is mentioned. There's 22 glyphs of the Hebrew alphabet along with the 10 sephirots, which are the formation of the tree of life which builds the man. That's a lot, isn't it? And right here you have a picture. You have verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Because as God begins to build His tabernacle, within that tabernacle is the immune system. It's the white blood cells. You know, I could go back, we will maybe not in this series, but we'll go back Genesis chapter 2, and we will look at the four rivers. The four rivers have to do with your heart and the blood system that flows in your physical body. And it's just there. It's not referring to literally four rivers over in the Middle East, like we've been told. So if you look at chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, and again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Does that sound familiar? It's exactly it's a repeat. It says the same thing. To present themselves among them. To present himself before the Lord. That's the only addition. That's different. They present themselves before the Lord. Before Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is not a tyrannical God in the Old Testament called Jehovah that became the national deity of Judaism. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh are the formulas of the four cardinal points of the cross. It's the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. And it's the cardinal cross. It's where every human being is hung on that. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. It's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And are those elements that builds the physical body. And the physical body is what this whole book is about and how it functions as God's tabernacle in God's house. That's who you are, and it does work correct. And from here, from this point forward, we move out of these 7 times that Satan is used into the story of Job. And as you move into the story of Job, Job has a dialogue between him and the 3 aspects of his being, which are his 3 friends. And that dialogue goes on for 30 chapters. And it's very, very interesting and very intense as you begin to look at it. And nothing that they say is true. What they say, if you go back, it's the projections of your physical body from 3 different perspectives. Mind, will, and emotions. Carnal mind. The strength of that carnal mind, which is your will. And then the emotional being that can be negatively used, or the emotional being that can be positively used. And if you listen to the emotional being that's negatively used, it'll always pull you down in depression. It always will. That's his friend Zophar. Zophar, who was a Naamanite. Naaman who had to go and dip in the river to be cleansed. Why? Because he's filled with negative energy. And you follow these characters and you realize, what are they always up against? They're always up against Satan. They're always up against that immune system that's in your physical body that's there to protect you and give you life. Satan is your friend.
We're almost the adversary.
We are. That's who we are. We become our own enemy.
I think a lot of it has to do with our mind. Our mind is our enemy.
Yeah, well, that's what these three guys represent. I did have, I'll just read them to you real quick in closing. I'll just close right here. Eliphaz. And Eliphaz, his name means the thoughts from the subconsciousness that have nothing to do with spiritual truth. That's what his Eliphaz. He was a Temanite. And a Temanite is from the south, or from the south just simply means it's from the place of abundance. Or south refers to the summer, the time of plenty and prosperity. So if you begin to realize Eliphaz, he will give you an abundant supply of things that's not true. He'll overload you with it. And you know what he'll tell you? This is what God said. This is the truth. And then you have Bildad. Bildad, whose name means contention. And he is the intellect that is apart from spiritual knowledge. It's the intellect that separates itself from spiritual understanding. And he was a Shuhite. And his name, Shuhite, just simply means to strive for that which appears to be right. It looks like it's true. Have you ever had that? I had something that come up on my hands. It really appeared to be true. My God, I saw it. I felt it. And I had Bildad right there, the Shuhite. I had him right there to confirm that he was through my own intellect, my own mind, will, and emotions. And then you have his third friend, who is Zophar, which actually his name means limited thoughts and reason. There is a reasoning that is of God, and then there is a reasoning that is of the carnal mind. Everything has a counterpart. And so Zophar was a Namathite, and his name, Namathite, just simply means he is agreeable. And he will agree, he will begin to agree with this plane of darkness, or this limited thoughts and reasoning that Zophar will give you. Those are their names. And that's what they mean. I mean, you can get any kind of a Bible dictionary that will give you the breakdown of these names. I've done the Hebrew and just broke their names down in Hebrew and looked at them to see what they mean and how they mean.
Those names you just got is from Job.
Job chapter 2, verse 11 is where they're at. That's the introduction. And then chapter 3 on, they begin a dialogue.